He was not famous in the way most commanders of World War II were remembered. His name did not represent strategy, victory, or military brilliance. Instead, it carried something far darker. On the Eastern Front, where the war had already descended into one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history, there were few lines left to cross, yet somehow he crossed them. Among both enemies, and even within his own ranks, he became known by a name that reflected exactly what people saw in his actions: the Butcher. His unit did not fight like others. They did not operate within the expectations of conventional warfare. Wherever they were deployed, reports followed. Villages destroyed, prisoners executed, entire areas left in silence. And as the war intensified, so did his reputation. Before we continue, if you appreciate historically accurate World War II stories told without exaggeration or fiction, we truly value your support. At WW2 Confidential, we focus on real events, real decisions, and the realities behind them. Make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. It helps us continue producing these documentaries. The Eastern Front was unlike any other theater of the war. Stretching from the outskirts of Germany deep into Soviet territory, it became a place where survival often replaced strategy. Millions of soldiers were deployed across vast distances, fighting in extreme weather, with limited supplies, and under constant pressure. In this environment, discipline often broke down, and violence escalated far beyond what had been seen in Western Europe. The man who would become known as the Butcher did not begin the war with that reputation. Like many officers in Nazi Germany, his early career followed a more traditional path. He was shaped by the aftermath of the First World War, a period that left deep political and social instability across Germany. As new structures of power emerged in the 1930s, he aligned himself with the regime that would eventually lead the country into another global conflict. His rise was not based solely on battlefield success, but also on loyalty and a willingness to operate without hesitation when given orders. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union opened a front that would define the war for years to come. It was not just a military campaign. It was a conflict driven by ideology, where entire populations were seen as enemies. Units operating in this environment were often given broad authority, with fewer restrictions and less oversight than in other theaters. It was here that his role began to change. No longer confined to conventional operations, he was placed in situations where the boundaries between military action and something far more extreme became increasingly blurred. His unit was not a standard formation. It was composed of men who did not fit into the regular structure of the army, individuals with criminal backgrounds, disciplinary issues, or those considered expendable. Under his command, they were given tasks that other units avoided. Anti-partisan operations, security sweeps, and actions behind the front lines became their primary role. These missions often involved targeting areas suspected of resistance activity, but the methods used went far beyond what was officially documented. Reports from these operations began to circulate. Not all of them were recorded in official channels, but enough evidence remained to build a picture of what was happening. Villages were cleared with extreme force. Civilians were not always distinguished from combatants. Prisoners were often not taken. The objective was not just to eliminate resistance, it was to remove anything that could potentially support it. And in doing so, his unit developed a reputation that spread quickly across the front. By the time the war had progressed deeper into Soviet territory, his name was no longer just associated with his rank or position. It had become something else entirely, a warning, a symbol of what could happen when orders were carried out without limitation. And as the Eastern Front continued to escalate, so would the actions that defined him and the name that would follow. As the war on the Eastern Front intensified, the role of units operating behind the lines became increasingly significant. German command relied heavily on anti-partisan operations to secure supply routes, maintain control over occupied territories, and prevent resistance movements from gaining strength. On paper, these operations were meant to target armed groups disrupting military activity. In reality, the situation was far more complex and far more brutal. The distinction between combatant and civilian often disappeared, especially under commanders who were willing to interpret orders as broadly as possible. It was in this environment that the man known as the Butcher expanded both his authority and his methods. His unit was deployed in regions where partisan activity was reported, but these areas were often vast, poorly defined, and populated by civilians who had little connection to organized resistance. Instead of conducting precise operations, his approach relied on overwhelming force. Entire villages were surrounded, searched, and frequently destroyed. Anyone suspected, sometimes without clear evidence, was treated as a potential threat. The logic behind these actions was simple: eliminate the possibility of resistance by removing everything that could support it. But in practice, this led to widespread destruction that extended far beyond military objectives. Unlike conventional army units, his formation operated with a level of autonomy that allowed these methods to continue without immediate intervention. Reports were filed, but oversight was limited. In some cases, higher command was aware of the tactics being used. In others, the scale of the actions only became clear much later. What made his unit particularly notable was not just the brutality, but the consistency. These were not isolated incidents. They were repeated patterns of behavior that defined how the unit operated across multiple regions. The composition of his unit also played a critical role. Many of the men under his command had been recruited from prisons or disciplinary units, given the option to serve in exchange for reduced sentences. This created a force that was already outside the norms of regular military discipline. Under a commander who encouraged aggressive and unrestricted action, these men became even more difficult to control. Orders were executed with intensity, but without the restraint expected in traditional military operations. As these operations continued, his reputation began to spread, not only among local populations, but also within the German military structure. Other units operating in the same areas became aware of the outcomes associated with his presence. While some saw the results as effective in suppressing resistance, others viewed them as excessive and counterproductive. There were concerns that such methods could increase hostility among civilians, ultimately strengthening the very resistance they were meant to eliminate. Despite this, his unit continued to receive assignments. The demand for rapid and decisive action behind the front lines meant that commanders who delivered results, regardless of how they were achieved, were often given further responsibility. This created a cycle where extreme methods led to continued deployment, reinforcing the behavior that had built his reputation in the first place. By this stage of the war, the name the Butcher was no longer informal or limited to a few accounts. It had become a widely recognized label, reflecting the impact of his actions across the Eastern Front. For those who encountered his unit, it represented a level of danger that went beyond the normal expectations of war, and as the conflict continued, the scale of these operations and their consequences would only grow. By 1942 and into 1943, the Eastern Front had entered a phase where control of territory was becoming increasingly unstable. German forces were no longer advancing at the same pace, and partisan activity behind the lines began to expand. Supply routes were attacked, communication lines disrupted, and entire regions became difficult to secure. In response, German command intensified anti-partisan operations, placing even greater reliance on units willing to operate without hesitation. For the man known as the Butcher, this meant more deployments, broader authority, and fewer restrictions on how those operations were carried out. His unit was now being sent into areas where resistance activity was either confirmed or suspected. These operations were often planned with limited intelligence, relying on general reports rather than precise targets. Instead of isolating specific threats, entire regions were treated as hostile zones. Villages were encircled, populations gathered, and actions taken quickly to eliminate any potential resistance. The justification remained consistent: prevent partisan activity before it could develop further. But the scale and execution of these operations continued to move further away from conventional military conduct. What made his command structure particularly dangerous was the lack of internal restraint. Orders were issued with broad objectives, but the methods used to achieve them were left largely to the unit itself. This created an environment where escalation was not only possible, but often expected. The men under his command understood that aggressive action would not be questioned, and in many cases it was encouraged. Over time, this shaped how the unit operated, turning it into a formation that functioned outside the normal expectations of discipline. At the same time, reports about these operations began to circulate more widely within German command. Some officers raised concerns about the long-term impact of such tactics. There was recognition that extreme measures could increase resistance rather than suppress it, creating a cycle of violence that became harder to control. However, these concerns did not immediately result in significant changes. The demands of the front, combined with the pressure to maintain control over occupied territories, meant that results were often prioritized over methods. For those living in the regions where these operations took place, the presence of his unit became associated with immediate danger. Movement was restricted, communication was limited, and entire communities were affected by actions that extended far beyond the initial objective. The unpredictability of these operations made it difficult to distinguish between targeted action and widespread destruction. This uncertainty contributed to the reputation that had already begun to define him. Within his own unit, cohesion was maintained through a combination of authority and expectation. The men understood their role, and the environment in which they operated reinforced their behavior. Discipline was not based on restraint, but on effectiveness in carrying out orders. This further separated the unit from conventional military structures, placing it in a category that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. As the war progressed and the front lines began to shift, the consequences of these methods became more visible. Areas that had been subjected to repeated operations showed signs of long-term disruption. Civilian populations were displaced, infrastructure damaged, and the distinction between military and non-military targets had largely disappeared. For German command, this raised questions about sustainability, even if those questions were not immediately addressed. By this point, the name the Butcher was firmly established across the Eastern Front. It was no longer just a reflection of isolated incidents, but of a pattern that had been repeated across multiple operations and regions. And as the situation on the front continued to change, the role of his unit and the actions that defined it would face increasing scrutiny. By late 1943 and into 1944, the situation on the Eastern Front had shifted significantly. German forces were no longer advancing. Instead, they were being pushed back across vast stretches of territory as Soviet offensives gained momentum. This change placed additional pressure on units operating behind the lines. Anti-partisan operations continued, but now they were conducted in areas where control was weakening and retreat was becoming a constant factor. For the man known as the Butcher, this meant operating in an environment where authority was still broad, but stability was rapidly disappearing. As Soviet forces advanced, previously occupied regions began to fall out of German control. In these areas, evidence of earlier operations became more visible. Reports, testimonies, and physical destruction left behind painted a clearer picture of what had taken place. While some of this information had already circulated within military channels, the shifting front lines allowed a wider understanding of the scale and nature of these actions. What had once been limited to internal reports now became part of a larger narrative surrounding the conduct of the war on the Eastern Front. Within German command, the need for units capable of rapid and decisive action remained. Despite the growing challenges, formations like his were still deployed where resistance activity persisted or where control needed to be re-established quickly. However, the effectiveness of these methods was increasingly questioned. The same tactics that had been used to suppress resistance were now contributing to instability in areas already under pressure. As the front collapsed in certain sectors, maintaining control through force alone became more difficult. At the same time, the structure of his unit continued to evolve. Reinforcements were brought in, often from the same sources as before, men who did not fit within regular military discipline. This maintained the unit's ability to operate aggressively, but it also reinforced the characteristics that had defined it from the beginning. The lack of conventional structure combined with a command style that allowed for broad interpretation of orders meant that the pattern of operations remained consistent even as the broader war situation changed. As Allied forces advanced from multiple directions, the German military faced increasing logistical and operational challenges. Supply lines were stretched, communication became more difficult, and coordination between units was often disrupted. In this context, formations operating with a high degree of independence could still be deployed quickly, but their actions were less connected to a larger strategic framework. This created situations where local operations had limited impact on the overall outcome of the war, even if they remained intense and destructive. The reputation associated with the Butcher did not diminish during this period. If anything, it became more widely recognized as information spread beyond immediate operational areas. For those within the German military, it represented a unit that could be relied upon to act without hesitation. For others, it reflected a level of conduct that raised concerns about discipline and long-term consequences. These differing perspectives existed simultaneously, shaped by the pressures and realities of a front that was no longer stable. As the war approached its final phase, the role of such units became increasingly uncertain. The conditions that had allowed them to operate in earlier years were changing. Front lines were moving rapidly, territories were being lost, and the ability to maintain prolonged operations behind the lines was reduced. Yet the legacy of what had taken place remained, carried forward by those who had witnessed it and those who would later document it. By this stage, the name "the Butcher" was no longer just tied to ongoing operations. It had become part of a broader understanding of how the war had been fought in certain areas of the Eastern Front. And as the conflict moved toward its conclusion, the focus would begin to shift from action to consequence, both for the individuals involved and for the historical record that followed. As the war moved into its final phase in 1945, the structures that had sustained units like his began to collapse along with the rest of the German war effort. The Eastern Front, once defined by vast offensives and shifting front lines, was now dominated by retreat, fragmentation, and the steady advance of Soviet forces. In this environment, formations that had operated with relative autonomy found themselves increasingly isolated. Coordination broke down, supply lines failed, and the ability to maintain organized operations diminished. For the man known as the Butcher, the conditions that had enabled his rise were no longer in place. With the collapse of German control in the East, attention began to shift toward accountability. As Allied forces advanced into previously occupied territories, evidence of past operations became more visible. Reports that had once been internal or incomplete were now supported by physical evidence and testimonies from survivors. What had been known in fragments during the war was now being documented more systematically. The actions associated with his unit, once justified under the framework of anti-partisan operations, were increasingly viewed in a different light. At the same time, the individuals involved faced the reality of a war that was ending. Some attempted to retreat westward, hoping to avoid capture by Soviet forces. Others remained in areas that were quickly overrun. The chaotic final months of the war made it difficult to track every movement, but the broader outcome was clear. The structures of command that had once protected or enabled certain actions were no longer functioning. Responsibility, which had often been diffused during the war, began to take on a more defined form. In the post-war period, investigations into wartime conduct focused on a wide range of activities across different fronts. The Eastern Front, due to its scale and intensity, became a central area of examination. Units that had operated outside conventional norms were subject to particular scrutiny. Testimonies from witnesses, along with surviving records, contributed to a growing body of evidence that shaped how these actions were understood. The reputation that had developed during the war, reflected in the name "the Butcher," was now being examined in the context of documented events rather than battlefield perception alone. For historians, the case represents a complex intersection of command responsibility, operational pressure, and the breakdown of established norms. The Eastern Front created conditions where traditional distinctions between military and civilian targets were often ignored. Within that environment, individuals who were willing to act without restraint could operate with a degree of freedom that would not have been possible elsewhere. Understanding this does not justify the actions taken, but it provides context for how such patterns developed and were sustained over time. The legacy of the Butcher is therefore not defined by a single event, but by a series of operations that, taken together, illustrate how the conduct of war can change under extreme conditions. It reflects the consequences of decisions made within a system that prioritized immediate results over long-term impact. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of structure, oversight, and accountability in military operations, elements that, when absent, can lead to outcomes that extend far beyond the battlefield. Today, the story remains part of the broader history of the Eastern Front. It is studied not only for what happened, but for what it reveals about the nature of the conflict itself. A war defined by its scale and intensity also produced moments and individuals that continue to challenge how that history is understood. And among them, the figure known as the Butcher stands as one of the most difficult to ignore.